Don't let my son see me like this. Alexander Hayes whispered the words so quietly that even the marble walls seemed to hold their breath. The most feared man in Chicago had faced angry rivals, courtroom threats, and rooms full of men who wanted his empire, yet none of them had ever made his hands tremble. His 8-year-old son had. Behind the closed bedroom door, Ethan was crying again.
Not loudly at first.
Just a small, frightened sound that traveled through the enormous house and settled somewhere deep inside Alexander's chest. He stood motionless in the hallway, surrounded by 3 members of his security team and a pediatric specialist who had already tried everything she knew. No one moved. No one knew what to say. Alexander's tailored charcoal suit looked as perfect as ever, but his expression had lost its usual certainty. He stared at the door, as though it were the one thing in the world he could not command to open. Then a quiet voice came from behind him. "Mr. Hayes." Alexander turned. Camille Carter stood several feet away, holding a folded stack of freshly pressed towels against her chest. She had been working in the Hayes residence for less than 2 weeks, and until that moment, Alexander had barely noticed her. She was a black maid who kept to the background, arrived before sunrise, finished her duties without complaint, and never asked questions about the family. But now her eyes were fixed on the bedroom door. She wasn't looking at Alexander. She was listening to Ethan. "What?" Alexander asked. Camille swallowed. "He's not crying because he wants someone to come in." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "Then why is he crying?" She took one careful step forward. "Because he thinks everyone is going to leave." The hallway became completely still. Alexander looked toward the door again. For years, he had believed protection meant controlling every detail around his son. The school, the staff, the rooms Ethan entered, the people Ethan trusted, even the sounds that reached his bedroom. Every decision had been made with one thought: keep Ethan safe. Yet somehow, despite all those precautions, the boy had become afraid of being alone. Camille lowered her voice. "May I sit outside his door?" Alexander stared at her. "You don't know him." "No, sir," she said. "But I know what it sounds like when a child is waiting for someone to stay." Something shifted behind Alexander's guarded expression. He looked at the door, then at Camille, and finally stepped aside. 5 minutes. Camille nodded and walked toward the bedroom. She didn't knock. She didn't enter. She simply sat on the carpet outside the door, leaving several feet between herself and the threshold. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then Ethan's crying softened. Alexander watched from the far end of the hallway, almost afraid to breathe. Camille said nothing. She simply remained there. 1 minute passed. Then another. Finally, a tiny voice came through the door. "Are you still there?" Camille looked toward Alexander before answering. "Yes, Ethan. I'm still here." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment. It was only 3 words. Yet somehow, they reached the part of him that years of fear had kept locked away. For the first time, he wondered whether protecting his son had become another way of teaching him to be afraid. And for the first time, Alexander Hayes understood something he had never wanted to admit. The one thing he feared most was not losing his power. It was losing his son while standing right beside him. For the next 3 days, Camille noticed something no one else seemed to notice. Ethan was never truly alone. Even when his bedroom door was closed, someone was always nearby. A security guard stood at the end of the hallway. A housekeeper passed by every hour. A specialist checked on him twice a day. And whenever Alexander Hayes entered the floor, the entire atmosphere changed. Yet none of that made Ethan feel safer. It made him quieter. The morning after Camille sat outside his door, she found a small wooden toy car on the carpet where she had been sitting. She picked it up and looked toward the bedroom. "Is this yours?" she asked softly. No answer came. Camille placed the toy beside the door and continued down the hallway. A few minutes later, she heard the door open. Ethan appeared, took the toy, and disappeared again.
Camille smiled but
said nothing. She understood that trust was not something she could demand. It had to be given. Later that afternoon, Alexander found Camille in the kitchen preparing tea for the staff. He stood near the doorway, watching her for several seconds before speaking. What did you do yesterday? Camille looked up. Nothing, sir. You sat outside my son's room. Yes, sir. Why? Camille set the cup down carefully. Because he asked if I was still there. Alexander's expression tightened. That is not an answer. She looked at him calmly. It is the only answer I have. For a moment, neither spoke. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor, catching the edges of polished silver and the dark wood cabinets. Everything in the house looked expensive, orderly, controlled. But Camille had begun to realize that Ethan's world was anything but orderly. The other staff say, he does not like people, Alexander said. He does not like being surrounded by people, Camille replied. That is different. Alexander studied her. You seem very sure. I am not sure about everything, she said. I just watch him. Those words stayed with Alexander long after she returned to work. Watch him. That was something he had forgotten how to do. He had watched Ethan constantly, but always through the eyes of a father searching for danger. Camille watched Ethan as a child. That evening, Alexander entered his son's room alone. Ethan was sitting near the window, with the wooden car in his hands. Where did you get that? Alexander asked. Ethan shrugged. Camille gave it back. Alexander sat in the chair across from him. Do you like her? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Why? Ethan looked down at the toy. She does not make me talk. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. What does she do? She stays. 2 simple words. Alexander looked toward the window, where the last orange light of the afternoon rested against the glass. He had spent years believing that keeping Ethan safe meant making sure nothing unexpected ever reached him. But perhaps the unexpected thing Ethan needed was someone who could simply stay. That night, Alexander changed one rule.
Camille was no
longer forbidden from speaking to his son. He did not tell her why. He simply signed the new instruction and left it with a household staff. What Alexander did not know was that Camille had already begun noticing a pattern that would soon force her to question everything she thought she understood about the Hayes family. By the end of the week, Ethan had started leaving his bedroom door open. It was a small change, almost invisible to everyone except Camille. She noticed it because she had learned to pay attention to the things nobody else considered important. A door left 2 inches open. A wooden car placed beside a pillow. A glass of water untouched on the nightstand. Small details told stories when people were too afraid to speak. Alexander noticed the change too, but he did not know what it meant. He only knew that his son seemed calmer whenever Camille was nearby. On Friday afternoon, Camille was dusting the upstairs hallway when she heard a soft sound from Ethan's room. Not crying, not talking. 3 quiet taps against the wall. She stopped. Then came 3 more. Camille looked toward the open doorway. Ethan was sitting on the floor beside his bed, tapping a small wooden car against the baseboard. Everything okay? She asked. Ethan nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Camille did not enter. Do you want me to stay? A pause. Then another nod. She sat in the hallway, just as she had done days earlier. Ethan continued playing with the car. After several minutes, he spoke. My dad does not like this room.
Camille looked at the doorway.
Why? Ethan shrugged. He says it is not safe. Camille glanced around. The room looked ordinary. Soft blue curtains. Shelves filled with books. A small desk beside the window. Nothing seemed unusual. Did something happen here? She asked. Ethan became quiet. Mom used to sit there. He pointed toward the chair beside the window. Camille felt the weight of the words, but did not push him. Do you miss her? Ethan nodded. Dad does not talk about her. Before Camille could answer, footsteps sounded at the other end of the hallway. Alexander appeared. His expression changed the instant he saw Ethan sitting near the doorway. Ethan, he said gently, it is time to come downstairs. Ethan immediately lowered his eyes. Camille noticed it. Alexander noticed it too. The boy had been relaxed seconds earlier. Now his shoulders had tightened. He was telling me about his mother, Camille said carefully. Alexander stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than the mansion itself.
We do not talk about that, he said.
Camille nodded. I understand. But Ethan suddenly spoke. Why not? Alexander looked at his son. Because some things are better left alone. Ethan's fingers tightened around the wooden car. But I remember her. Alexander's face softened for just a moment. Then he looked away. I know. He walked toward the stairs, but Ethan did not follow. Camille remained seated beside the door. She could see something changing inside Alexander, something he was trying very hard to hide. That evening, while organizing the household records in the office, Camille noticed a framed photograph tucked behind several old folders. She did not touch it. She only saw enough to recognize the woman standing beside a younger Alexander, smiling with one hand resting gently on Ethan's crib. The date beneath the photograph was 8 years earlier. Camille looked again and noticed something unexpected in the background. The same wooden chair from Ethan's bedroom. Her curiosity became concern. Why had Alexander removed the photograph from the family room? Why had he stopped speaking about Ethan's mother? And why did Ethan seem to believe that his father was afraid of the past? Camille quietly returned the folder to its place. She had entered the Hayes household to do a job. Now she was beginning to understand that the silence inside that mansion was hiding a story, and somehow, Ethan was still carrying the part of it no adult wanted to face. The next morning, Camille found Ethan standing alone beside the old staircase, holding the wooden car against his chest. He looked toward the front entrance, as if he were waiting for someone who was never coming. Ethan? Camille said softly. He turned but did not answer. Then he looked toward the study. Dad is in there. Camille followed his gaze. The study door was closed. Do you want me to stay with you? Ethan nodded. Before Camille could sit down, the study door opened. Alexander stepped into the hallway, a folder in one hand. His expression was calm, but his eyes immediately went to the photograph Camille had seen the night before. It was no longer hidden behind the folders. Alexander had placed it on his desk. You saw it, he said. Camille did not pretend otherwise. Yes, sir. Alexander studied her for a moment. How much did you see? Only the photograph. He nodded slowly. Her name was Claire. Ethan looked up at the sound of his mother's name. Alexander noticed and lowered his voice. She was Ethan's mother. Camille waited. Why does nobody talk about her? Ethan asked. Alexander looked at his son, then toward the window. Morning light stretched across the polished floor, turning the dust in the air almost golden. Because after she was gone, Ethan stopped sleeping. He would wake up every night asking when she was coming back. Ethan lowered his head. I still ask sometimes. Alexander's expression changed. The words had clearly reached somewhere he kept protected. Camille remained silent. She understood that this was not a moment for advice. It was a moment for truth. Alexander placed the folder on a nearby table. I thought if I removed reminders, he would eventually stop hurting. Camille looked at him gently. Children do not forget because adults stop talking about someone. Alexander said nothing. Ethan stepped closer to the photograph. She liked this chair. Alexander nodded. She used to sit there and read to you. Ethan touched the edge of the frame. Why did you hide it? Alexander took a slow breath. Because every time I looked at it, I remembered how much I could lose. Camille finally understood. The strict rules, the constant supervision, the closed rooms, the careful routines. Alexander had not created them because he believed Ethan was fragile. He had created them because he was afraid. But before she could say anything, Ethan suddenly looked toward the front hall. His expression changed. Camille, he whispered. What is it? Ethan pointed toward the entryway. A small envelope rested on the console table. No one had mentioned it. Alexander noticed it too. He walked over, picked it up, and stared at the handwriting on the front. His face became completely still. Camille watched him carefully. What does it say? She asked. Alexander did not answer immediately. He turned the envelope over once, then looked at Ethan. It is from someone who knew your mother. Ethan's eyes widened. Who? Alexander folded the envelope in his hand. Someone I hoped we would never hear from again. Camille felt the atmosphere in the house change. This was no longer only about grief. There was something else buried beneath the silence, something Alexander had spent years keeping away from his son. And now, after 8 quiet years, The past had found its way back to the front door. Alexander did not open the envelope. Instead, he carried it into the study and placed it on the desk beneath the warm pool of light from the brass lamp. Camille stood near the doorway while Ethan remained in the hall, watching his father with an expression that seemed older than 8 years. "Who sent it?" Camille asked. Alexander looked at the handwriting again. A woman named Margaret Ellis. Camille waited. She worked with Claire before Ethan was born. Alexander's voice had become quieter. "She disappeared from our lives after Claire died." "Why?" Alexander looked toward the photograph on his desk. "Because she knew things I did not want Ethan to hear." Camille could sense that he was choosing every word carefully. "What kind of things?" Alexander opened the envelope at last. Inside was a single handwritten note and an old photograph. He read the note silently. His expression changed, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief. "What does it say?"
Camille asked.
Alexander handed her the paper. The message was short. Margaret wanted to meet him. She said there was something Claire had asked her to keep safe until Ethan was old enough to understand. Camille looked up. "Understand what?" Alexander took the note back. "I do not know." From the hallway came Ethan's quiet voice. "Is it about Mom?" Alexander turned. Ethan was standing at the doorway.
For a
moment, father and son simply looked at each other. Then Alexander nodded. "Yes." Ethan stepped inside. "Then I want to know." Alexander's instinct was immediate. He wanted to tell Ethan that he was too young, that some memories were better left untouched, that he would explain everything someday. But he remembered Camille's words from earlier in the week. Children did not forget because adults stopped talking. "There are things about your mother that I have never told you," Alexander said. Ethan looked at him carefully. "Because they make you sad?" Alexander gave a small nod. "Yes."
Ethan thought about that.
"Then you can be sad with me." The room went silent. Camille looked away, giving them a moment that belonged only to father and son. Alexander sat down. Ethan climbed into the chair across from him. "Your mother loved music," Alexander began. "She used to play the piano every Sunday morning." Ethan smiled faintly. "I remember that." Alexander looked surprised. "You do?" "A little." For the first time in years, Alexander began telling his son small stories about Claire. Her favorite coffee. The books she kept beside the bed. The way she laughed when Ethan tried to say his first words. Nothing frightening. Nothing complicated. Just memories. Camille watched from the doorway as the atmosphere in the room slowly changed. The photograph was no longer something hidden. It became part of the family again. But then Alexander reached the final page of the note. His face became serious. Margaret had written one more sentence. Claire had not wanted Ethan to inherit his father's fear. She had wanted him to grow up knowing that his father loved him, even when that love became difficult to understand. Alexander read the sentence twice. Then he looked at Ethan. "I think your mother knew me better than anyone." Ethan reached across the desk and took his father's hand. Alexander looked down at their hands, visibly moved. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then the telephone on the desk rang. Alexander answered. Margaret Ellis was waiting at a nearby cafe, and she had something else to give him. Something Claire had left behind 8 years ago. Alexander slowly looked toward Camille. The past had opened one door. Now, someone was waiting on the other side. The cafe was only 15 minutes from the Hayes residence, but Alexander drove there as though every mile gave him another chance to change his mind. Camille sat quietly in the passenger seat while Ethan remained at home with the household staff. Alexander had insisted on going alone, yet at the last moment he had asked Camille to come with him. He did not explain why. Perhaps he simply trusted her now. Or perhaps he had realized that she was the only person who could tell him when fear was making his decisions for him. Margaret Ellis was waiting near the window when they arrived. She was an older woman with silver hair, a navy coat, and a worn leather handbag resting beside her chair. When Alexander approached, she stood slowly. "You look exactly like your father," she said. Alexander stopped. "You knew my father?" Margaret nodded. "Years ago." Her eyes moved to Camille, then back to Alexander. "And this must be Camille." Alexander's expression tightened. How do you know her name? Margaret gave a faint smile. Claire told me about the woman who would one day help Ethan. Camille felt a chill move through her, but she remained silent. That is impossible, Alexander said. Claire never knew Camille. Not Camille specifically, Margaret replied. She knew there would be someone. She opened her handbag and removed a small wooden box. It was old, carefully polished, with a simple brass clasp. Alexander stared at it. Claire gave me this 3 weeks before Ethan was born, Margaret said. She told me to keep it until Ethan was old enough to understand what was inside. Alexander did not reach for it. Why did you wait 8 years? Margaret's expression softened. Because you were not ready. Alexander looked away. Those words landed harder than he expected. Margaret placed the box on the table. Claire knew you loved your son. She also knew that fear could make you build a life around protecting him instead of letting him live. Alexander's jaw tightened. Camille watched him carefully. This was the same truth she had seen inside the mansion, only now someone from Claire's past was saying it aloud. Alexander finally opened the box. Inside was a small silver key, a photograph of Claire holding baby Ethan, and a folded letter with Alexander's name written across the front. His hands became still. He unfolded the letter and began to read. Claire's words were gentle, simple, and unmistakably personal. She wrote about Ethan's future. She wrote that he would need freedom, mistakes, laughter, and people he could trust. Then came the sentence that made Alexander stop. She had written that if he ever became so afraid of losing Ethan that he forgot to let his son live, he should remember that love was not a locked door. It was an open one. Alexander lowered the letter. For several seconds, he could not speak. Camille looked toward the window, giving him privacy. Margaret reached across the table and touched the box. There is one more thing. Alexander looked up. What? Claire did not only leave that letter for you. She left something for Ethan. Alexander's expression changed immediately. Where is it? Margaret smiled sadly. At the old family house in Lake Forest. She asked me to keep it there until Ethan turned 8. Alexander glanced at the date on his watch. Ethan's birthday had been the previous month. 8 years old. The timing was exact. He stood slowly, holding the letter against his chest. For the first time, the future did not feel like something he had to control. It felt like something he needed to allow his son to discover. And somewhere inside the old house by the lake, a final piece of Claire's story was waiting for Ethan to find it. The old family house stood beside Lake Michigan beneath a pale afternoon sky, its stone walls softened by years of ivy and quiet. Alexander had not returned since Claire's funeral. He parked near the circular driveway and remained behind the wheel for several seconds, staring at the front door. Camille sat beside him, holding the small wooden box Margaret had given them. Ethan was in the back seat, looking through the window at the house. Mom lived here, he asked. Alexander nodded. Before you were born, yes. Ethan pressed his hand against the glass. It feels familiar. Alexander looked at him through the rearview mirror. Maybe you remember more than you think. They entered together. Dust covered the furniture, but the house still carried traces of Claire everywhere. Her piano stood near the windows. Her books remained on the shelves. A faded blue scarf rested over the back of a chair. Ethan walked slowly from room to room, as if following memories he could not fully name. Camille stayed close enough to help but far enough to let the family moment belong to them. Then Ethan stopped. The piano. Alexander looked at him. What about it? Mom used to play that song. He pointed toward the old piano. Alexander walked over and lifted the cover. On the music stand was a sheet of paper, yellowed with age. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Claire had written a short melody for Ethan before he was born. Ethan looked at his father. Can you play it? Alexander hesitated. I never learned. Camille noticed something on the piano bench. A small envelope had been tucked underneath it. Alexander picked it up. His name was written on the front, but beneath it were 4 words. For Ethan, when he is ready. He handed the envelope to his son. Ethan looked at him uncertainly. Can I open it? Alexander nodded. Ethan carefully unfolded the paper inside. There was only one sentence. Your father loves you more than he knows how to say. Ethan looked up. Alexander's eyes had become glassy. Is that true? Ethan asked. Alexander knelt beside him. Yes. Then why does he worry all the time? Alexander took a slow breath. For once, he did not search for a perfect answer. Because I was afraid that if I stopped worrying, something would happen to you. Ethan considered his words. But I am here. Alexander smiled faintly.
Yes.
You are. Camille watched quietly as father and son stood together in the soft afternoon light. Then Ethan noticed another detail. Inside the envelope was a small key. What does this open? He asked. Alexander looked at the key and immediately recognized it. A narrow door stood at the end of the upstairs hallway, one he had kept locked for 8 years. He had never told Ethan what was behind it. Now, Ethan was looking directly at him. I think your mother wanted you to see it, Alexander said. They walked upstairs together. Alexander unlocked the door. Inside was a small room filled with childhood photographs, books, drawings, and a wooden rocking chair. Nothing frightening. Nothing secret in the way Alexander had feared. It was simply a room Claire had prepared for Ethan. On the wall hung a handwritten note. Welcome, my little one. I hope you grow up knowing that you never have to earn love. Ethan read the words slowly. Then he turned toward his father. Did you know this was here? Alexander shook his head. I forgot. Camille understood that he had not really forgotten the room. He had forgotten how to enter it. Ethan reached for Alexander's hand. You can come in with me. Alexander looked at his son, then stepped across the threshold. For the first time in 8 years, he entered the room he had been too afraid to open. And neither father nor son noticed the small photograph lying beneath the rocking chair, where Claire had left one final clue about why she had trusted Alexander to raise Ethan in the first place. The photograph beneath the rocking chair showed Claire standing beside a younger Alexander, one hand resting gently on his shoulder and the other holding a tiny pair of baby shoes. Ethan picked it up carefully. On the back, Claire had written a date and one sentence. He will need both of us, even when one of us is gone. Alexander stared at the words for a long moment. Then Ethan looked up. What does she mean? Alexander sat beside him on the floor. She meant that she wanted me to remember that being your father was not supposed to mean doing everything alone. Ethan looked toward Camille. She stood near the doorway, giving them space. Does she have another message? He asked. Alexander turned the photograph over again. Beneath Claire's handwriting was a small mark he had never noticed before. A simple star drawn in blue ink. Camille recognized it from the old photograph Margaret had shown them. That symbol was on the box, she said. Alexander looked at her. You are right. He walked to the desk in the corner and opened the wooden box again. The silver key was still inside. Beneath it was a second piece of paper folded into a narrow square. Alexander unfolded it and read silently. Then he handed it to Camille. The message was from Claire. She had written that if Alexander ever found himself building walls around Ethan, he should seek out the people who reminded him that trust was not weakness. Camille read the final line twice. You will know them by the way they make Ethan feel safe. She looked toward the boy. Ethan was sitting beside his father, completely relaxed, holding the old photograph. Alexander understood before Camille said anything.
She meant you, he said.
Camille shook her head. She could not have known me. Maybe not you, Alexander replied. But she knew the kind of person Ethan would need. Ethan looked between them. What are you talking about? Alexander smiled gently. Your mother wanted you to have people around you who made you feel safe. Ethan looked at Camille. She does. The simple answer left Alexander quiet. Outside, the lake reflected the late afternoon sky, and the old house seemed less empty than it had when they arrived. But before they could leave the room, Ethan noticed something else beneath the desk. A small notebook had fallen behind one of the drawers. He picked it up and handed it to Alexander. The cover was worn, but Claire's handwriting was unmistakable. Alexander opened the first page.
It was not a diary.
It was a collection of letters Claire had written for Ethan over the years, one for every birthday she expected him to celebrate. There was one for his first birthday, another for his second, and another for his fifth. The final letter was marked 8 years old.
Ethan stared at it.
Can I read it? Alexander nodded. Ethan opened the page and began slowly. Claire wrote about the kind of person she hoped her son would become. Not powerful, not perfect, just kind, curious, brave enough to ask questions, and wise enough to let people help him. At the bottom was one final sentence. Never measure love by how tightly someone holds you. Measure it by how freely they let you become yourself. Alexander lowered his eyes. For years, he had believed that every open door was a risk and every unknown person was a threat to the life he had built around Ethan. Now his son was showing him another possibility. Ethan closed the notebook and reached for his father's hand. I want to go home, he said. Alexander smiled. All right. As they walked downstairs, Alexander paused beside Camille. Thank you, he said. Camille nodded. For what? He looked toward Ethan, who was waiting by the front door. For staying. Camille followed his gaze. He needed someone to stay. Alexander looked back at her. So did I. The words surprised them both. But before either could say more, Alexander's phone rang. It was the head of household security. There was a message waiting at the main residence, and it concerned Ethan. Alexander's expression became serious. The quiet afternoon was over. Whatever came next would test whether he had truly learned to trust the people standing beside him. By the time Alexander returned to the Hayes residence, the sun had disappeared behind the Chicago skyline. The house was quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was not the heavy silence Camille had noticed during her first days there. It felt expectant. Ethan was sitting in the living room with a book open on his lap when Alexander entered. He looked up immediately. Dad. Alexander walked over and sat beside him. I am here. Ethan studied his face. You look worried. Alexander smiled faintly. I was. Ethan closed his book. About me? Alexander paused. Then he answered honestly. Yes. Ethan looked down. Did I do something wrong?
No.
Alexander reached for his hand. You did nothing wrong. Across the room, Camille watched quietly. She could see how different Alexander was from the man she had first met. The same tailored suit, the same controlled posture, but something inside him had softened. He was no longer trying to hide every feeling from his son. The message from security, Camille asked carefully. What did it say? Alexander looked at her. Nothing dangerous. Someone from the house staff found an old box in storage. Camille frowned. Another one? Alexander nodded. It belonged to Claire. Ethan immediately stood. Can we see it? Alexander looked at him, then smiled. Yes. They walked together to the study. The box was sitting on the desk. Inside were photographs, letters, and a small collection of childhood drawings. Ethan picked up one drawing and smiled. It showed 3 people standing beside a blue house. That is you, he said, pointing at Alexander. And that is Mom. He pointed to the second figure. Then he pointed to the third. Who is that? Alexander looked closely. His expression changed. I do not know. Camille stepped closer. The drawing showed a woman standing beside Claire and Alexander. Beneath the figure, Ethan had written a single name in uneven letters. Margaret. Alexander looked at Camille. Margaret said she knew Claire. Camille nodded. Then perhaps she was closer to your family than you realize. Alexander studied the drawing again. Suddenly, Ethan spoke. Dad, are you still scared? Alexander looked at him. The question was simple, but it carried everything they had learned. He took a slow breath. Sometimes. Ethan waited. But I am learning that being scared does not mean I have to control everything. Ethan smiled. Good. Alexander laughed softly. It was a small sound, unfamiliar in the quiet house. Camille smiled too. Then Ethan reached for the notebook Claire had left behind. Mom said I should become myself. He looked at his father. Can I? Alexander's eyes filled with emotion. You can. Ethan stepped forward and hugged him. Alexander held his son gently, without trying to tell him how long the moment should last. He simply stayed. Camille turned toward the window. Outside, the city continued moving. unaware that inside the mansion, something important had changed. Alexander Hayes had spent years believing that love meant keeping every possible danger away from his son. Now he understood something Claire had known from the beginning. A child did not need a perfect world. He needed someone who would trust him enough to grow within it. Alexander looked toward Camille. "You were right." She smiled. "About what?" He did not need someone to control him. Alexander glanced at Ethan. He needed someone to stay. Camille nodded. And now he has two people who will. Alexander looked at his son, then at the open doors of the house. For the first time, he did not feel the urge to close them. The mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home. And the man who had spent his entire life protecting everyone else finally understood that the greatest form of protection was not fear, control, or walls. It was trust. That night, Alexander turned off the hallway light and left Ethan's bedroom door open. He did not stand outside it. He did not ask the security team to watch every movement. He simply walked away, trusting that his son would call if he needed him. A few seconds later, Ethan's voice came softly from the room.
"Dad."
Alexander stopped. "Yes. Good night." Alexander smiled. "Good night, son." Then he continued down the hallway, lighter than he had felt in years. And in the quiet house beside Lake Michigan, the most powerful lesson of his life finally settled into place. Love was never meant to be a locked door. It was the courage to leave it open.